My name is Aaron Kissel. I am the executive director for the financial services practice at the Corporate Executive Board. We're a research firm. We have about 10 different research programs that cover financial services. When initially asked about the talk today, the framework was, I have an idea. And I did a little bit of thinking about regulation, how we got to where we are today. And I think my idea is that there are basically three factors, three drivers that I think got the financial services industry sort of where it is today. And two of them are mostly, in many ways, outside of near-term control. So the three factors are sort of necessary for where we were at. One is a large-scale event, which obviously happened with both the economy and some would say business practices that got us here. The second one that you'd need to get to this moment is, what is your response to that moment? And I think that's where I'd like to spend the majority of our time today, is what has been the response itself from the industry in terms of fixing the issues that got us here. And I think the third, again, less addressable per se by the players, but a reason why financial services has behaved the way that it has, is it's a relatively entrenched industry that is not used to change and is not used to risk-taking. And so to inject that level of change and uncertainty from regulation, from the economy, from technology, is very difficult in an industry that is as entrenched and has such large players as financial services. I don't see that last one changing, and I actually don't see the first one in terms of the economic conditions that got us here changing radically on a global basis either. I do think there is opportunity in the middle, though, to think about what is an individual institution's response to the drivers that got them here, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about. For banks to be in a position where they are today globally, to be facing regulatory demands from the populace, there needs to be an underlying bit of truth to the need for it. And we have conducted a big survey globally around the sentiments of the average financial services consumer, and both what they told us specifically about their concerns, as well as what they told us but are not telling their financial services provider, sit at the center of that second issue about what are the choices that banks can make about how they're going to operate differently. So I can take you through a couple of slides on that. One of the biggest ones we found was 31% of financial services consumers have a dissatisfactory event annually. So if you think about why people leave firms, why they switch providers, it's towards the high end of any industry that we have seen. And for some industries with relatively spotty reputations in terms of service, auto dealerships come to mind very particularly, to be threefold behind them in terms of the likelihood of a dissatisfying event, it creates an environment where regulation is demanded and becomes a political thing versus very difficult to drive and get through. We also looked at what are the words that consumers think about when they think about financial services. Many of them are not words that the marketing department in a financial services firm would feel good about. And so that grain of truth, I think, is the thing that how they respond to it and how we can help them respond to it might make the fate of regulation a little bit less daunting. Underneath this sort of compounding issue a little bit is, of those that experience a dissatisfier, so that 31%, only 65% of those made a formal complaint or actually hit any of the systems that most of the banks would actually track in terms of their number of dissatisfied. 35% didn't complain in a formal way. So the size of that gap about satisfaction driving to the underlying level of anxiety in the consumer base is because a lot of those comments are not officially tracked in any system. And so as firms think about sizing the level of dissatisfaction, there's at least a third, let's say, increase on the risk that they see right now. There's also those that make informal complaints that are not tracked structurally in many organizations, and many that just do not complain publicly but might complain in other mediums like social media. Another interesting just statistic, 26% of a global survey responded that they trust financial services as an institution to do right by them. So you've got nearly 75% of global consumers in a sort of adversarial position with their financial services provider. That in and of itself is the driver, I think, in many ways, of the political conditions that allow regulation to get very aggressive. And there's a nice opportunity here for them to do right by their customers and also potentially prevent regulation from continuing to be such a dominant force in their lives. Lastly, just of those again, 31%, if roughly half have a issue resolved, the other half don't. So a very small percentage of people that have a dissatisfying event end up leaving that dissatisfying event, which are going to happen when you have millions and millions of consumers, in a place where they feel good about that outcome. So roughly 7% or so at the end of that funnel end up in a place where people feel good about where they were at. And I think as you think about how the uses of technology and sort of the charter of these institutions, finding a way to get after the both declared dissatisfied and the hidden dissatisfied can go a long way to shoring up how regulation is going to be impacting them. We did a little bit of sizing. What does this mean to the average financial services firm, so the average retail bank? It's nearly $500 million at risk per bank if you think about the attrition rates due to people who have had a dissatisfactory event or had a dissatisfactory event and it wasn't resolved. And that's a significant amount of money at risk. We recently have, our research teams anyway, have been very fascinated by the Fire Your Bank Day that was November 5th. I don't know if many of you saw it. We had hosted a meeting maybe 6 months ago with heads of marketing from financial services firms. And social media was, the topic was social media, was fairly widely criticized about our anticipated risk that we saw with the power of social media. We had a senior person from one of the top 5 banks in the US totally dismiss social media as being a factor in his business, his bank. And to have 300,000 people notified in a given week, and then the actual rules and steps to how to fire your bank posted on Facebook, and 50,000 people within 2 days sign up to take advantage of that, should be a wake-up call to those that think both consumers are in a good place or that somehow the social media is going to not be a big factor in their business. It is a big factor in their business, and if these levels of dissatisfaction continue, there's going to be a lot more change that has very little to do with regulation. It's going to have to do with consumers making different choices. We did profile MetLife, which is a fairly progressive insurance firm, about how they were mapping out both tracking expressed dissatisfiers as well as unexpressed dissatisfiers, and started to very aggressively track. The biggest thing for them was when the issue was unexpressed. So could they tell from language that was used in a call center where someone is slightly dissatisfied, or could they tell that they knew that they had made a mistake even though no one had brought it to their attention in either a statement or something else, and proactively addressing that fact. And so those firms that essentially get after the volume and then resolution of dissatisfied, I think will go a long way to changing and slowing what regulation might come their way. Lastly, 2 more slides. This one is probably a little bit complicated, but if you think about what we mapped out here is what are the drivers of loyalty? So that's on the horizontal axis. And then the frequency at which consumers express that as a problem. And we actually found that 2 things that technology leads itself a great deal to solving is conscientiousness and thoroughness. Conscientiousness being defined up here as, did you take consideration for the person's concern? So the fact that you addressed it and took consideration is a big step. Thoroughness is, how did you actually, what was the quality of the product that you actually were solving? As we start to see firms that are really innovating, and particularly developing new products that are more technology-based, you see them to be stronger in these areas than the more traditional financial services products that are based on convenience or timeliness in terms of, let's say, a traditional branch network. We've mapped out how to think about what are the prevention causes or prevention steps that firms might go through to prevent essentially either defection rates or the rise of new competitors. And where you see red here is where there's a lot of touch points on the risk associated to the firm for not addressing it, as well as the frequency at which that risk presents. And a lot of them, if you look in the bottom right, have to go to how you can customize and personalize the experience for the individual consumers. And I do think that's a place where big data that we had talked about in the morning and more sophisticated consumer interfaces can both allow consumers to express their dissatisfaction, track the data, and anticipate where those concerns might be. Lastly, in closing, what is the impact of all of this? One of the things that we found is that those that are proactive in addressing customer dissatisfaction, both expressed and hidden, have a much higher loyalty rate than those that do not. And we saw 3 traits of those firms that do well here. So one, a clearly defined resolution process. If consumers know how to engage with their financial service provider, they know what the financial provider will do, they're much more likely to take a step forward. 2, personalized service. This also happens a lot in person now. I think our view is this will happen much more virtually as technology goes forward. And lastly, the idea of minimizing consumer effort. How can you make it easy? And if you look at either the statements that people get or how difficult it is to apply for a mortgage, the industry will be forced to minimize the consumer effort one way or the other. And I think those that do, and you start to see it potentially in some of the payment space, you really start to see new players bringing whole new lenses to the marketplace that if that third element that I said in the beginning wouldn't change in terms of the established players, I think if you play this movie out long enough, you will have people that do these 3 things that you've never heard of today. They'll be solving those problems for people in a relatively near future. So thank you for having me, and I'll hand it over.